Hi guys, it's Pete from MyJewelryBench.com. Today I want to help a couple of the viewers on YouTube who are having some problems and difficulties with using curves and how to work with them. And I know it can seem like a daunting task, but it's pretty easy. So let's get started. Okay, so before we move on, I just want to talk about a few things. I'll be using the default settings in Blender 2.9. I don't change the settings other than a few add-ons that I add. If you are having difficulties with Blender 2.9 and your keys don't work as I run through them, I just want you to remember you can set these back up to the default values. However, if you do that, and let me show you how to do that, you come over to Preferences, open up the Preference tab for Blender, and if you come down here to these three little lines in the bottom left corner, you click on that and you can say Load Factory Preferences. By doing so, it will reset Blender back to its default settings. However, you will have to go back and reset things like scales, unit settings, and your add-ons. Adding or putting the add-ons back can be a little bit intimidating because most people don't realize how easy it is to do. But to do that, just come back to the add-ons tab right here. Under where it says All, just hit that drop-down box and go to User. And when you do reset your settings back to default, all of these will be unchecked. So go ahead and reactivate your add-ons by putting a little check mark in the check boxes. All the settings will be as you originally set them up, so you don't have to worry about that. And when you're done, just close this up. Okay, so working with curves is not a very difficult thing, and you can do some things. I'm not going to touch on every single thing that you can do with a curve. However, I do want to touch on a few things, and I'm going to start very simply. I'm going to get rid of this model. Okay, so to get started, all I want to do is hit Shift-A. I'm going to bring up my Add menu. I'm going to come down to Curve, and I'm going to select a circle. And here we have a circle, and according to my unit measurements and my view settings, I have this down to 2 millimeters, and I want to use this to make a ring, so I'm going to make that very simple. I'm just going to make this 18 millimeters by 18 millimeters, and of course there's no depth to the Z-axis because this is just a flat object. You can change the settings for your Bezier circle here, so I can basically just kind of move things around. I can give this a radius, do whatever I want with it here. Once I click off of that, my settings are permanent on my curve. So here I have a curve that is approximately 18 millimeters round. I'm going to rotate that on the x-axis. I'm going to hit the R key and then the X key and then 90 to rotate that along the x-axis. Now here I have a circle curve in object mode, and if I hit the tab key to go into edit mode, you see what happens. I have these little lines, and these are influence lines to modify the curve itself. So it's tough to see, but if you look at this black circle here, you can see that it's influenced by these dots here. And if I take just this dot and I want to move that over, and let's just say I just move that. Let's look at this from the side. If I move that and a G key to influence that, you can see what I do when I move that particular dot. If I stretch it out, if I bring it closer, if I move it out that way, and you can see basically I can influence how that curve shape works. Okay, so that'll work with any particular curve that you have, something like that. I'm gonna right click on that to cancel it, and let's grab this center button which grabs all of them. If I hit the G key, I can move that all the way over. You can see how it influences, and if I move it out, it's kind of stretching it and sizing it. I'm going to hit the right mouse button to cancel that. I can also hit S and then Z, and I can move that along the Z-axis because I'm moving it up and down. Remember, I'm looking from a side view of this particular model, so the blue axis is the Z-axis, which is our depth axis. If I select all, I can also size that and just do whatever I want. I'm going to cancel that. And I'm going to leave it at that. So I can do just about anything I want to this curve in edit mode. One other thing that you can do, if you select all and then you right click in edit mode, you can come down to subdivide, and that gives you a multiplication of 2 of the points at which you can influence. And of course, if I look at this from the side view here, and I'm going to center this here. Now I have many more points at which I can influence my curve or my circle however I want to do it. Now it's different than an object curve or an object circle. And let me just do this here. I'm going to exit out of this. I'm going to hide this particular model. I'm going to go Shift A and I'm going to go to Mesh, and now I'm going to add in a circle. Now I will size this up to 18 millimeters. And I will leave Z alone. I'm going to rotate this just like we did before, RX90. So I'm rotating it along the X-axis. So now it's straight up and down. And I have a circle just like the other one that is approximately 18 millimeters. However, if I go into edit mode now, you can see that I only have points, and I just select my vertex group here, and these points have no influence over any of the others. So if I move that down, let's say G, Z, and I move that down, you can see what I'm doing here is I'm only moving that one point, and the other point stays where it is. When you're working with a curve, you get a much more flow feature with the object itself. But when you're working with an object, you can only move points, or if we select an edge here, I can select an edge right there, and then I can move that around, and you can see it only affects that edge and the edges next to it because I'm moving that whole piece by itself. And if I rotate this, I can rotate it like so, and that gives you a little more influence. However, because this object is an object and not a curve, it really does not allow you to flow along the complete circle. So let's get rid of this. I'm going to go back into object mode, hit X, and delete this. Let's make our Bezier circle visible again. Okay, so now with the Bezier circle selected, I can do several things to this. If I want to, of course, my channel is all about modeling jewelry, working on watches, and 3D printing. So let's talk about this as a band. If I want to turn this into a ring to work on a design for a lady's fashion ring per se, I need to give this some depth and I need to give it some dimension. And to do that, when we have a curve object, you'll get this little tab here, and if I select on it, if I move my cursor over to it, you can see it's the Properties tab for the Bezier circle. And then I can change my resolution, and sometimes you want to do this. I'll change this to, let's say, 24, and we'll leave it at that. That just gives me a finer detail. And then there's the Geometry tab here, sub-tab, which is the most influential. And I'm just going to make this a little larger so we can see. So we have several things here: the offset, the extrude, the depth, the resolution. I typically use two of these. I use the extrude and the depth. And here's how those work. So if I want to add some extrusion to this and give this some depth, I can just come over here and extrude this. And while I'm extruding this, you'd think, well, I'm 0.8 millimeters here, but that's not true. My model size here would be affected by the Z-axis label, which is 1.6 millimeters. So now you can see I've basically made this loop to be 18 millimeters round by 1.6 millimeters in depth. So keep that in mind, and I suggest you keep your Items tab open when you're working here. If you can't get this tab to show, it's the N key on your keyboard, and if you press it, it goes away. If you bring it up, it'll come back. So again, I can adjust this and make this, let's say, 2 millimeters. So now I have a 2 millimeter wide ring that is approximately 18 millimeters in its dimension. Now, that's just a flat ring, and you can see it doesn't really do much with it, so let's give this some depth. I can come over here and I can add to the depth here, and if I add to the depth, let's change this back to 0 because I do want you to see how I'm handling this. I'm going to come back and look at this from the side view. Now, we have our circle, and if you're looking at your curve, it is a complete circle, or just about a complete circle. It's not a perfect circle, but it's a good start. If I come over here and I start influencing the amount of depth that this has, you'll see that it extrudes the depth of this object equally on either side of the line of the circle. So if I do this, you can see I'm influencing from the center outward or inward equally. Okay, now that will sometimes work, except now I have this issue here where the inside of my ring is 18 millimeters, and that's the size that I'm working for, or I'm looking for my ring. So now there's a way to work with that, and you can do the same thing by adding a modifier, and then coming over to add modifiers down to solidify. Now if I add solidify to this, I can add the thickness. Okay, now you see if I modify this thickness value here in the plus section, it makes it smaller on the inside. However, if I make this negative value I'm actually making it bigger from the outside, or from the inside out. So now I still retain the 18 millimeters on the inside, but now whatever dimension I have here, which is 24 millimeters, now I have basically 3 millimeters of width on this band, or depth, if you want to call it that. And then I can adjust it however I want. So let's say I want this to be 2 millimeters. We know that our band is 18 millimeters, so I'm going to bring this out to 22 millimeters, and let's see if I can get that right there. And now basically I have a 2 millimeter wide band along the z-axis this way, and then 2 millimeters thick by 22 millimeters round with an 18 millimeters center. So you just have to keep that in mind. Of course, we don't see the 18 millimeters because that value is gone. It measures the outside perimeter of our circle or our curve, but that's how you do that. Now I want to change this to a mesh so that I can model with it. So to do that, I'd basically come here, right click on this, and then come down to convert, where is it, to a mesh. Once I do that, all my features and modifications are applied. This does not have a curve properties tab any longer because it's a mesh, which is denoted by this triangle here. So now it looks pretty funky in Blender 2.9, so if you have the see-through button activated, I would suggest turning that off, and that is right here. So I'm going to turn that off so that we're looking at a solid object. And now I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to come down to smooth or shade flat, and now you can see here is our model, and it's flat shaded. It's a little easier to work with when you're working with a shade flat object. And then I can apply, or I can go into edit mode, and you can see I can make changes to my model. Even so, if I want to make this a little thicker, I can hit size, hit the S key, then the Y key, and then I can move that and make this a little wider, just like so. And if I look at my item tab here and go back into object mode, you can see now we're 5.35 millimeters thick. And again, this is showing up as the z-axis, which is the up and down axis, just so you can put this clear in your mind, it's because I haven't applied the rotation and scale to this object. If I do that, and I do that a lot, you'll notice when in my videos, you press Control A on the object, come down to rotation and scale, and now you'll see your values have changed here, and now my Y value, which is this green line, is now 5.35 millimeters, and the X and Z axis are 22 millimeters, which represent the top of the ring or the outer perimeter to the other side of the outer perimeter. Again, we retain the 18 millimeters in inside dimension. And I am going to bring in a new curve. So I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to come down to curve, and I'm going to select the Bezier curve. And let's size this up. Now, one of the quirks in Blender 2.9, sometimes you will apply or add in a curve object, and it will automatically enter into edit mode. If it does that, just press the tab key. You'll see that it'll end up being little lines, and your curve itself will be black. I like to work in object mode or in non-edit mode. So let's just take this object. We're going to make this a little bit bigger, and let's make that a little larger than that. So now I want to have something follow this curve. I want to give this some dimension, and there's a couple different ways that you can do this. And I'm just going to go back into edit mode, and I'm going to take this from the top here, and I'm going to move it. I'm going to make that a much sharper curve. Now from here, I think I'll do an extrude, and this is something you can do in edit mode with your curve object. If I hit E, and then I can move that over here and just kind of give that a little bit of a bend up. We'll just do something like that. So let's go back into object mode, and now you can see our curve has a nice little shape to it. I'm just doing this as an example. Okay, again, if you're working from top down or perspective mode, you can move things along whatever axis you're working on. If you're in this mode, you could end up with shapes that are all kind of weird. You'll figure it out. I've gone over that before in other videos. So if you want to see some more videos, I suggest looking at the playlist for 3D modeling and jewelry design for Blender. So let's do this. I'm going to add in a mesh, and I'm going to add in a cube. Okay, so let's just make that a little bit bigger. And now let's take our cube, let's go into edit mode, and let's make this, oh, let's just stay in object mode, doesn't matter. I'm going to size this along the x-axis, SX, and I'm going to make this 48 millimeters. That's just probably too long. We'll make that a little smaller, SX, and I'm going to just bring this down just about like so. And now I have this rectangular square tube, if you want to call it, and I want to mold this so that it becomes the shape of my curve. So now if I take this object, I can apply a curve modifier to it, and that allows me to take this object and have it follow the path of a curve or form the path of an existing curve. Now I can take an object and I can make it form to the path of a curve, but I can't take a curve and make it form to the path of an object. I hope that makes sense. Curve modifier, and then I'm going to select the Bezier curve. Now you can see it did something weird, right? It just didn't work. I'm going to cancel this. We're going to get rid of this modifier by deleting it with the little X key here, and now you see we're back to our cube. And now there's a change that you have to make to your cube. You have to go back into edit mode, so hit the tab key with the cube selected. And now we're going to give this a bunch of loop cuts. So I'm going to hit Control R. I'm going to start with a loop cut in the middle, and I can use my mouse wheel to increase these or decrease these, or I could just type in a value on my keyboard. I'm going to type in 100 and then press enter twice. Okay, go back into object mode. Now I'm going to add in a modifier so that this cube will align to the path of the curve. So with the cube selected, I'm going to come down and add in a curve modifier. I'm going to select our Bezier curve, and you can see now it gives us the results that we wanted, except it's a little offset. So to make this look better, I have to, I'm going to look at this from the top down, and I'm going to hit GX, and I'm going to rotate that or make it, put it about there. And if I hit SX, I can actually make this cube a little smaller so that it flows along the path, just like so. Now this will not work unless you have your object in edit mode with these loop cuts on it. If you don't have these loop cuts in edit mode, if you don't add them, you can't bend this object. It needs these loops to basically bend the shape of the object. Similar to using the Shift W key to bend an object, you need loop cuts in that, and just keep that in mind. The heavier your mesh is looped or cut into, the better it will bend. You can see that I have this cube that now conforms to the curve. And when I go into edit mode, you can see that it also puts our cube back to its original position. So how do you get around that? Well, come back to your modifiers tab, with the cube selected, and you can hit here, this little tab here, which allows me to leave the cube in position when I enter edit mode. So if I press the tab key, you can see how this actually looks along the curve, and then here is my modifier or my editable object. So if I come over and I select faces and I select this face and then I hit extrude, and I'm going to extrude this along the y-axis, I'll hit E and then Y, and then if I bend that out, you can see what happens to our model. It shows up with the extrusion right there, and if I go back into object mode, there it is. Now it didn't put that along the right axis, so again I suggest you play with it just to get used to how it does that. So now in edit mode, you can see we have the original cube along the curve. Let me just zoom in here, and now we have our editable cube. If I want to see the editable cube along the path of the curve too, I can also click this little button here, and you can see now it puts that along that section. So now every time I enter and exit edit mode, my editable object also mirrors the shape that it's applied to. Sometimes that's good to work with, sometimes it's not, so keep that in mind when you're modeling, because you can find that you can work with this in different ways. Okay, so we're back to our default settings, or our default screen, and now I'm going to show you one more little trick, and then I'm going to tell you to go play with the curves and play with their modifiers and just play with the shapes and come up with your own little designs, because I think it's really fun to learn how to use curves. I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to come down to curve, and then I'm going to come down to knots, and I'm going to add in a torus knot. Okay, so here's the effect that I have on my torus knot, and you can see we entered that object in edit mode, which is a function of Blender 2.9. I can come over to the knot settings here and I can select whatever I want. If I want to do a different knot, a skinny knot, or just come over and play with these. You can do whatever you want with these. And now we have resolution, and I can change the resolution. I can change the spins. I can decrease them and increase them. Now I'm going to do something like this, just because I want to come up with some cool little model. And if I look at that, that doesn't look too out of place. I'm kind of liking that. But again, we can come over and we can adjust all the segments. We can increase the depth if I want to make this thicker. And basically all your curve properties that were on the curve tab, you can basically modify here and give those a cool little shape. So, don't hesitate to play. And I'm going to drop that extrusion down to 0 one more time. I'm going to drop this up to 0.1, and there is the model that I'm working with. And again, I can keep playing with this if I want, but I'm going to show you, once you've created this object using the curve panel, if you just click off of it somewhere like over here, we come back to press the enter key. I can come back into object mode, and then I can look at this. Let's turn that off, and there is our object. That's a pretty cool looking object. Let's say I wanted to use this around a stone, or whatever I wanted to do. If I needed a cute little design for maybe an armband, if you're modeling characters or whatsoever, this allows me to work with that. Again, you just have to remember, curve objects are not objects or meshable objects. They are curves, so they have some limitations when you're 3D printing, so keep that in mind. Before you can go and send this to your 3D printer, you do have to right click on it and then convert it to a mesh. Before I do that, let's just prove that we've got other modifications we can make. We can come back to our curves tab right here, and now I can go to the geometry subtab, and I'm just going to pull this out a little bit more, and then I can make depth changes to this, and you can see I can make it a little bit more solid, something like that. Now there's no opening within the inside of this, and I get this little cool pumpkin shape. That looks pretty good. I can also change certain values on the other sections if I want to stretch it, bound clamps, change the resolution, smooth it out or not smooth it out. And again, go play with these because they will allow you to make some really cool modifications. So if I bring this back down just a little bit like that, and I play with the offset value here, you can see what it does to that value. Makes a cool little springy thing that looks like it's from a 1950s sci-fi movie maybe. I like the way that looks. And we're just going to Control Z and cancel that. If I use the extrude value, you can see what it does. It extrudes it a certain amount by adjusting certain values to the curve properties. And again, we can go and cancel that. And again, just play with this. This is what it means to really work with curves. And when you get it to where you want it, again, these are all points, and if I grab a point, you can see I can just kind of move my whole curve in any direction I want and change these values. If I grab that and just kind of move that somewhere, you can see what it does. If you don't like it, just press Control Z until you cancel what you changed. When you're happy with that, go back into object mode. And I'm going to zoom in here. When you're happy with that, go back into object mode, and then you can right click on it, convert this to a mesh. And now if I enter edit mode, you can see I have a meshable, modelable, sculptable model. And that itself can be 3D printed according to your 3D printer parameters. Okay, so there's one more thing about curves that's pretty cool. There used to be a couple little steps that you could take in Blender where you can make an object follow a path. So for instance, if I wanted to have diamonds placed along a path, I could do that within all the default settings in Blender. However, now in Blender 2.8 and beyond, in Blender 2.9 too, we have to use an add-on. And I wish Blender would add this back in, and I think maybe I'll send them an email. If I want to have an object like with the JewelCraft tool, if you've been using that, and if you don't have the JewelCraft tool installed, I would suggest going and getting it, because there are some features in that work with modeling in other aspects, not just jewelry design. For instance, I'm going to add in a curve, and I'm going to add in a Bezier curve. I'm going to size this up, to about here. And I'm going to show you some of the good and bad things that you can do in Blender. I'm going to hit a cube. I'm going to add in a cube to this. And now I want to take this cube and I want to create an array of this cube and follow it along a path. So this is pretty cool. So I'm going to select my cube. Let's turn off invisible mode. I'm going to come down to my modifiers tab and I'm going to select array. And I'm going to make 5. Yeah, let's do 6. And now we can offset those cubes from each other. You can see we're offset by 1. If I want to make that, let's say 2, that works pretty good. So now I have an array based on my original cube, which is the only editable object here. And I want to make these cubes follow the path, follow that NURBS path. So I'm going to select my cubes. I'm going to go to my modifiers tab and we're going to add in another modifier. We're going to add in the curves modifier. I'm going to select the path that I want it to follow. And you can see if I look straight down and we zoom in, unfortunately it deforms our cube. They're no longer square, completely square, except for this one because it's on a straight line. All the other ones have some dimensional errors to them. And sadly that was taken out of Blender in Blender 2.8 and beyond. So let's look at this from a different aspect. And I'm just going to cancel these. We'll just get rid of this. And we've got our cube back. So with the Jewel Craft tool, there's a cool little feature in this that I love and I've used for years with other versions of Blender. And then now we have it built into Jewel Craft. Let's select our cube. I'm going to hold the shift key down. I'm going to select our path. And with those two selected, the cube first and the secondary object, the path, I can hit distribute onto curve. And now I can come over here and modify this by selecting how many I want. Let's drop this down to 6. And then the size of those cubes. I could also change certain settings here, the tilt of each of those. And I'll change that back to 0. I can also select the rotation. And then I can also change the starting point. Let's change that back to 0. The starting point and ending points, which is pretty cool. And we've shown you how to do that with Jewel Craft in the past. But what's nice about this is, and I'm going to click off of this and make that permanent. Now when I go and adjust my curve here, it modifies how the cubes are affected along that curve. And now you can see it does not deform the cubes. So that in itself, the cubes basically retain their shape, and I end up with a good model if that's what I'm looking for. I hope that helps you work with some curves. I encourage you to go ahead and play with the curves tools and just have a blast. Don't be afraid to make mistakes because obviously you're just working on a computer. It's not going to affect anything. And if you go ahead and just play and play and play, you will get used to the curves. It took me about an hour to get used to all the settings in Blender 2.9 with all the new features that are in it, but it's really not that complicated. So don't think that curves are a big deal. And there's a place to use curves and many more things that we can do with curves that I will show you in examples later on in more tutorials. If you like this video, guys, please give it a thumbs up. If you can, please share it on social media. It does help my channel grow. And if you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And every time I upload a new video, you can get a notification by hitting that notification bell. Thanks for watching. And if you want to support my channel, please go to my webpage, www.myjewelrybench.com. Thanks for watching and have a great day.